Before Park Geun-hye became South Korea's first female president, she was the lonely child of the Blue House, raised inside one of the most powerful and most haunted families in modern Korean history. People later saw her as a conservative icon, a disciplined campaigner, and finally a president brought down by scandal. But long before the impeachment, before the candlelight protests, before the courtroom and the prison cell, there was a girl growing up under ceremony, surveillance, and the impossible weight of a father who seemed to embody the state itself. Park was born in Daegu in 1952, and after her family moved to Seoul, she grew up in the presidential residence once her father, Park Geun-hye, rose to power and then became president in 1963. She studied at Sacred Heart Girls High School and later earned a degree in electronic engineering from Sogang University in 1974. From the outside, it might have looked like the ideal life of a ruler's daughter: prestige, protection, education, and constant proximity to national importance. But children raised inside power do not simply inherit privilege. They inherit atmosphere. They absorb silence, hierarchy, fear, and the sense that private life is never truly private. Park Geun-hye did not grow up as an ordinary girl who later entered politics. She grew up inside politics before she was old enough to choose it. That is where the central tension of her life begins. She did not have to fight her way toward power from the margins. Power was already around her, but it came fused to loneliness. The Blue House was both a palace and a cage. Her father's authority was immense, but it left little room for normality, spontaneity, or escape. And then the structure that defined her life began to collapse through violence. In 1974, her mother, Yuk Young-soo, was killed in an assassination attempt aimed at her father. 5 years later, Park Chung-hee himself was assassinated by the head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. In the span of a few years, Park Geun-hye was transformed from the daughter of a ruling family into the survivor of a shattered one. The story that followed was never simply about a politician rising. It was about a woman who inherited power as trauma, who spent years living inside the shadow of murdered parents, and who eventually returned to the very center of state authority, carrying both their symbolism and their burden. The deeper question of her life is not only how she became president, it is how someone born inside power became both its heir and, in the end, one of its most public victims. Park's early adulthood was shaped by grief before it was shaped by ambition. When her mother was killed in 1974, Park was suddenly thrust into a public role she had never prepared for. Reuters later described her as having effectively taken on the role of First Lady after the assassination, a detail that reveals something crucial about her formation. She was not just a daughter mourning in private. She was drawn deeper into the public theater of the presidency at precisely the moment when personal loss should have pulled her away from it. The state absorbed her grief and turned it into duty. For a young woman barely out of university, that kind of transformation could harden the soul. It taught her that family tragedy would never remain personal for long. It would always be processed through ceremony, image, and expectation. Then came 1979, and with it the second wound. Her father, who had dominated South Korean politics for nearly 2 decades, was assassinated by KCIA chief Kim Jae-kyu. That second killing did more than leave her orphaned. It destroyed the entire architecture that had organized her life. The father whose authority had shaped the nation and whose shadow had shaped her identity was suddenly gone. In later years, Park would continue public activity through educational and cultural foundations, but for a long period she lived outside elected politics, almost suspended between the memory of one regime and the uncertainty of what her own role might ever become. This period matters because it created the emotional texture of the politician she would later become. Park Geun-hye was often described as reserved, distant, self-contained, even hard to read. Those qualities were not merely quirks of temperament. They were also the marks of a life formed by public trauma and long isolation. While other future politicians were building networks, testing ideas, and learning the rhythms of compromise, Park was becoming a symbol before she became a strategist. She was the daughter of Park Geun-hye, the woman who had stood near state power and then watched it take both of her parents. In countries with long democratic continuity, family name can be a convenience. In South Korea's 20th century history, family name could feel closer to fate. That is why her eventual political return carried such force. She did not come back as a blank conservative politician. She came back as someone whose biography already belonged to the national imagination. Even before she won a vote, she was living proof that the Park legacy had not disappeared. What made her powerful later was not only policy or party discipline, it was the emotional architecture built in these years, the solitude, the resilience, the silence, and the sense that history had marked her long before she chose to answer it. When Park Geun-hye formally returned to politics in the late 1990s, she did not re-enter public life as an unknown. She returned as the daughter of one of the most consequential and controversial leaders in South Korean history, and that lineage immediately gave her both strength and limitation. Britannica notes that she was elected to the National Assembly in a 1998 by-election, and over time she became a central figure in conservative politics, later leading the Grand National Party and then the Saeonuri Party. Her rise was not the rise of a fiery outsider or a reformist visionary. It was the rise of a figure who seemed to offer steadiness, discipline, and symbolic continuity to voters who still associated her father's era with order and national development. She learned to use that image carefully. Park often projected composure rather than intimacy. She rarely appeared impulsive. She spoke the language of duty, stability, and national seriousness. For supporters, this restraint looked presidential. For critics, it looked cold and overly controlled. But either way, it made her different. In a noisy democracy, distance can itself become a political style. She became known as the Queen of Elections because of her success in helping conservative candidates and because her presence carried almost mythic value for the party base. Yet even at the height of her party leadership, the shadow around her never fully lifted. Her political strength was always tied to inheritance. She could mobilize memory, but that also meant she could never completely escape it. The more she rose, the more the country was forced to ask whether it was choosing Park Geun-hye, the politician, or Park Geun-hye, the vessel of an older era. That ambiguity did not stop her ascent. In fact, it may have fueled it. She had a talent for surviving hostile moments within her party, and her political image was strengthened by the sense that she could endure attacks without emotional collapse. That steadiness was part discipline and part biography. A woman who had already survived national trauma could appear unusually calm in ordinary political turbulence. It also helped that she embodied a particular conservative fantasy: order without overt brutality, legacy without open dictatorship, authority softened by the image of a daughter rather than a general. By 2012, with the official presidential profile noting her victory in the 18th presidential election, and Reuters reporting that she had become the first woman-elected president of South Korea, Park completed a journey that seemed almost impossible a generation earlier. The daughter, who had once served as de facto First Lady after her mother's murder, was now returning to the Blue House as head of state. It was a powerful historical loop, and one she understood well. But this was also where the hidden weakness of her rise became most dangerous. Because her authority rested so heavily on symbolism, image, and disciplined distance, it was less clear how deeply it rested on open trust. She had mastered the politics of inheritance, but the presidency requires more than inheritance. It requires transparency, persuasion, and the ability to survive scrutiny, not just as an icon, but as a governing individual. Park had finally reached the summit of legitimacy. Yet the same inheritance that lifted her there had also trained her to govern from behind emotional walls. Park Geun-hye took office in February 2013 as South Korea's 11th president and its first female head of state, promising a new era of hope For supporters, her victory seemed to fuse democratic legitimacy with the prestige of a political dynasty that still held deep emotional resonance among conservatives. For Park herself, it may have felt like the completion of a long and painful arc. The child of the Blue House had come back not as a mourner or symbolic daughter, but as president. Yet power at its peak can also expose the habits that once helped a person survive. Park's leadership style was frequently described as insular and tightly controlled. That in itself might not have destroyed a presidency, but it made the government vulnerable to the exact kind of hidden influence that later detonated her administration. The crisis came through the scandal involving her longtime confidant, Choi Soon-sil, who was accused of using her relationship with Park to influence state affairs and pressure corporations for donations. What made the scandal so devastating was not only the legal allegations, it was the image it created. A president whose public persona rested on discipline, distance, and incorruptible seriousness now appeared compromised by a private relationship operating beyond normal institutional scrutiny. The hidden world behind the carefully managed facade suddenly became visible. Public fury erupted. Millions joined candlelight protests, demanding her removal. The scale of those protests mattered because they showed that Park's political isolation was no longer just a feature of her personality. It had become the atmosphere around her government. The public no longer saw reserve as dignity. It saw silence where explanation should have been. It saw a presidency that seemed emotionally cut off from the country at the very moment the country wanted accountability. On December 9, 2016, the National Assembly impeached Park. The Constitutional Court, in a unanimous 8-0 ruling on March 10, 2017, upheld that impeachment and removed her from office. The official court summary makes clear that she did not complete her term because the impeachment motion was sustained, while Britannica and Reuters both traced the scandal to the collapse of her presidency. This was not just a political defeat. It was a symbolic inversion of everything her rise had represented. The woman who had embodied conservative endurance and historical continuity became the first South Korean president removed from office through impeachment. The Blue House, which had defined her childhood and crowned her return, became the stage for her most public humiliation. In many ways, the fall made visible the deeper structure of her life. Park had always lived inside inherited power, but inheritance can distort judgment. It can encourage loyalty over openness, symbolism over accountability, and private confidence over public explanation. The same isolation that once made her seem strong now made her look unreachable. The same self-containment that once suggested dignity now suggested concealment. Her presidency did not collapse only because of one confidant or one scandal. It collapsed because the model of authority she embodied could no longer survive democratic exposure. After her removal, Park Geun-hye's story moved from tragedy into reckoning. She was arrested, tried, and convicted on corruption-related charges, and Reuters reported that by the time she was pardoned in late 2021, she had spent nearly 5 years in prison. The pardon, granted by President Moon Jae-in on grounds described by the Justice Ministry as connected to national unity and her health, closed one legal chapter, but not the historical argument around her life. Park Geun-hye remains one of the most polarizing figures in contemporary South Korean politics because her story is almost too symmetrical to ignore. She was born into executive power, shaped by assassination and loneliness, elevated through the memory of a father who still divided the country, and then destroyed by a scandal that exposed how vulnerable inherited authority can become when it is not matched by transparent leadership. That symmetry is why her life feels almost novelistic. Yet the point of her story is not that fate is cruel. It is that power transmitted through family, trauma, and symbolism can produce a leader who seems at once formidable and strangely defenseless. Park was never a simple continuation of her father, but she was never free of him either. She benefited from the emotional capital of the Park name, from the nostalgia it inspired, and from the discipline it seemed to represent. At the same time, That same inheritance trapped her inside expectations she could not fully control. She had to embody resilience without appearing vulnerable, authority without appearing ordinary, and continuity without becoming a relic. For years, she managed that balancing act. Then it broke. And once it broke, the collapse was total, because the image sustaining it had been so total in the first place. What remains is a legacy shaped by paradox. She made history as South Korea's first female president. She also made history as its first democratically elected president to be removed from office. She entered politics through memory, rose through discipline, governed through distance, and fell through exposure. Even her pardon did not erase that contradiction. To supporters, it confirmed that she had become too convenient a scapegoat for a larger political culture of elite influence and opaque networks. To critics, it changed nothing essential, because the removal had already become a constitutional lesson about how democratic systems respond when presidential power drifts into private dependency and abuse. If her father's story was about building a state through control, hers was about discovering how fragile control becomes in a democratic era when secrecy, loyalty, and personal networks are dragged into the light. In the end, Park Geun-hye's life is not simply the story of a fallen president. It is the story of a daughter who inherited power before she understood its cost, carried the loneliness of that inheritance for decades, and finally learned that the shadow which raises a person can also become the place where she disappears. That is why Park Geun-hye remains such a compelling political figure. Her life was shaped by inheritance, but never secured by it. She reached the summit through memory and discipline, only to prove that in democratic politics, inherited authority can delay collapse, but it cannot save a leader once trust is gone.